Yeah, I mean, as a fundamental building block for a life cycle, I would suggest that environments is going to be one of the first places that even as a citizen developer, you might start to explore. So if I just click this here, you'll see we've got some terribly set up environments, but we've got environments, and all that really means is we've separated our concerns. When you join the Power Platform, when you join a tenant, you get access to be a maker or a citizen developer. You will by default get access to this default, not Collab 365 default, but a default environment. Just means it's the place where everybody goes. I call it everything, everywhere, all at once. We can all go and make apps. We can make flows. We can create data. That's fantastic. But there are limits to that environment as a box. It is a finite resource that we can all use. So what I've started to see is that the recommendation for people is before you do anything, think about your environment strategy for you and your team. And this is where I go back to that. It depends, Connor. There's no like one right answer here. So for me, I'll just pull up the environments. There's two things you even need, and I may as well get the elephant out of the room to start with. You're going to need either the ability to do some administration, to create environments, to add users to environments, or you're going to need a very friendly administrator who's prepared to help you. The other thing is when I come on to a life cycle and the process that you need to put things into another environment, you're probably going to incur a bit of a cost. And I'll come on to that because it is a bit of an elephant in the room for this whole process, but I sort of understand why. And I'll try and explain that to you. So number one, you're going to want to think about environments. For me, I mean, Microsoft probably will advocate in some of their documentation, and do go and have a look at it. I've got a few links down here that I'll send to you in a minute. They will probably advocate having somewhere to develop, somewhere to test, and somewhere to put your production artifacts, if you like. And the reason for that, and I'd be interested in your view, Connor, if I say this to you, what it means to you is the idea is you separate your concerns. If I say that to you, does it make any sense?
It feels like I understand what you're trying to say, but I mean concerns. Are we talking about perhaps like iterations of a development process? So let's say, for example, I don't know, I'm working on something very specific inside of an app. Maybe it's a certain release that we want to release to people. When we say concerns, are we talking about the difference between that release being in its development phase to go in through testing in another phase to go into its actual release?
Could be, yeah. I mean, that's a really good example of why you might want to do that. It might even just be, as you know, when I said at the very start there, the default environment everybody gets access to. You might have like a team who have a concern over HR apps, a team who have a concern over different kinds of apps, a team that I don't know how your organization's spread out, but that's just one example you gave there. I think it's a really good example. You might be thinking, can I create a place where everyone can develop safely and experiment safely? Can I then create a place where we can bring things together? Can I create a place where all my production flows and apps are safe and I know nobody's going to delete them by mistake? So however that word concern is interpreted for you, I think that's you're probably along one really common example there. That's where I think people create environments. So you'll see here, forgetting all the silly named things, what I've got here is a really simple example. If I were in a larger team, I would probably make this Collab 365 default something like an awareness, what would I call it, like an onboarding zone. So all the apps that I want people to see when they first join my organization might be here. I might name it familiarization, and it might be a whole bunch of onboarding apps that I want people to use. Then what I might like to do, and in my case, I've already done this as an example, is you give people these developer environments. So I've shown this before, but you've got different kinds of environments. Environments are boxes, really, in the simplest terms, that just encapsulate some Power Platform artifacts and mechanisms, and they allow you to separate these concerns depending what you need. So for me, to go to your analogy there, we would probably have a developer environment each where we could develop our apps and flows, and we could do what the blooming heck we like there. That would be lovely. we would then possibly have a test environment, which probably could be a sandbox. It could be production. Doesn't really matter. That's just in the name. But we might have another place where we then promote or push our product, and that'll be your next stage of your ALM. And then the last zone, the last product that I would have, the last environment I'd have, will be a production place, a place where all my finished artifacts go. So to me, the separation of concerns is start to develop and finish is the production zone. So that's like number one piece of this puzzle. I think organizations, I don't know, I'd be really interested if people do use environments or whether it's just us experimenting.
I'd say I think again our kind of, what's the word, our setup is probably quite different compared to a lot of users. But I mean, I think we've used environments in a very different way.
We've used them. We've done a different separation, haven't we? Here, Connor, we've got like game development, so our games and our sort of gamification apps might go, and I think that's legitimate. To be honest, I'd probably argue that what we might do is if we decided we'd finished something in its iteration, we'd probably have like a production location for those apps. And of course, you've got to think really carefully that each of these environments has a bit of a storage overhead. So you've got to think carefully not to just go environment spam. And that's a whole different topic. So George, uses dev, shared QA, test, production. Makes complete sense. That ticks in my brain because I've seen people use that in AWS and all sorts. And that's very legitimate, Valerie, using default because you're the only one creating the apps. I mean, that's absolutely fine. If you were using and creating apps for your clients and you have multiple clients or teams, you might consider having separation of concerns there. But it's an individual thing, I think. But back to the original point and bearing in mind time, number one building block, environments. Anybody have a guess at number two building block if you are going to start to think about moving your products from A to B to C? Big prize of a big chocolate bar for there won't be a prize for anybody who can guess the next thing. Yeah, there you go, James. I thought you might get it. Good lad. Yeah, solutions. So the next thing that you're going to want to explore, and we have a blog series about this, and I'd welcome anybody to read it, critique it, add to it, find the gaps in it. But where I went next was I thought, I'm going to keep my default environment. Whether I have the default or the new developer environment doesn't matter. Just imagine that's my stage one. I went to myself, if I want to put things from stage one to stage two, so into the production zone, what do I need? And that's where you go into the concept of power platform solutions. So I'll just show you what one looks like. Yes, Gail, they do. To me, they make things a lot easier. They make it easier for a lot of different reasons. So if you were going to have like the most basic ALM, my belief is that all you really need is a solution, which is a package of things, effectively, given a name, given some clever bells and whistles, and an environment. Because you can see here, I don't know if I just clicked in there too quick, but hopefully not. This is just a named event submission. These are actually flows. Doesn't matter that I'm accessing it via Power Apps. This is just a bunch of flows. Before this, we had these just sat as flows under my flows or shared flows. And actually what happened is we accidentally deleted one. Luckily, we had a backup of it, but we decided to package them up in a solution because we could then take that whole solution and move it. The easiest thing you can do, if I right click on there, left click, sorry, is you can export that solution. All you're really doing is, let me just quickly go into a solution. You can add things to solutions. So you can add flows, you can add apps, you can, as you see here, you can add data. You can add components, connection references, and I'll come on to that in a minute, but you can add stuff to it. It's another just box, basically. So in my head now, I've got this Russian doll thing going on. I've got like a first level, which is my solutions. I've just popped them into here. You get the benefit of then being able to run something called a solution checker, which will check this thing hangs together and it can be moved, and you can export them. And I think I'm correct in saying this, Connor. These are just zip files, aren't they? Is it a zip file or is it a different? Because you use this in your challenge, don't you?
Yeah, I don't believe it's in fact, you're probably right, it is a zip file. And that zip file usually contains
Yeah, I haven't got one handy.
various different files that that are
It
basically
does.
part of the package. So if you've got apps in here, you'll get the .ms app. If
Yeah.
you've got flows in here, that will, I'm not sure how that, I think it gets carried across as like a .xml, I think. But yeah, that's something that we have used before, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So, I mean, yeah, look, the bottom line, the point I'm trying to make here is that I'm showing you two things. I'm showing you environments, which you've got a bit of research and a bit of work to do to set up your version of what a life cycle might look like. And then you've got the way that you package up your product. And the way that I've chosen to package it up is in a solution. And I've done this because you can export it. It is one thing named as one thing, which contains many, which is another benefit. But the other beautiful thing is it kind of pushes you down a path of starting to use things called connection references. Again, I'm sorry I'm asking the chat quite a lot of questions, but does anybody use connection references right now in their flows outside of solutions? Be really interested to know if you've touched on that at all. I see Gail's typing.
Got a few thumbs up.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Again, like I'm relatively new to this. So if you're trying to put all your flows in solutions, Gail, I'd strongly recommend you think about connection references. Have you ever used these, Connor?
I believe that any connection references that I've ended up with in solutions have automatically been created by me,
Okay.
and I think subconsciously it's happened behind the scenes, and I've not been
Yeah.
aware that that's what it's called and that's what's happened to it.
Yeah. Again, I'm going to use that Russian dollar analogy, and no, let me think of a better one. If I have a box, which is my solution, and it's sat in an environment, the default environment, that box has it has plugs going out of it. For example, this particular one has a connection which goes to SharePoint. Let me just see if I've got an example of that. Yeah, here we go. So under this menu here, you've got connections. So in this environment, I have approved connections to other services. So what I've always done, and I've only just stopped myself doing it, I've always created a flow. I've then said I need a connection to SharePoint. Oh, I'll go and use my ID to connect to SharePoint because I know I can access that SharePoint list, and I've just encapsulated it in the flow itself. You'll see it. It's like it's got the approved connections. All that's really doing is just creating a connection here that's me to a service. So if I'll just quickly type in SharePoint. So I've typically just used my own connection to SharePoint. The idea of a connection reference is solutions encourage you to use them because they decouple the product itself from that authenticated connection. And so what you then end up doing is having your environment, which has your connections. So the bigger box has the connections that are approved, and the smaller box, your solution, you just plug them in. And then when you start to move your solutions from environment to environment, if you use this pipeline method that I hope I'll squeeze in today, it just does all that automatically for you. So long as in every environment you move to, you've set up some connections. And I'll try and demo that to you in a moment. So I'll just read the chat. Settings in Power Apps auto create connection references. Yeah. So this whole process works much better when, if I go back to the solution, you've set up these connection references. I'll show you one because there's no like dodgy information being given away. If I go back into my solution here, in this environment, I have a connection to Forms and it's authenticated under the service account. So all I've really done here is I said, it's like an alias, a pointer. I've said, I'm going to create a reference called SharePoint lists, and any of my flows that I've got in this solution can now use that SharePoint lists as the reference to whatever that needs to go and do. And in this environment, the service account connects to SharePoint. And it's actually a lot easier when you get into it to set these things up. I love it. It like transformed it for me, but I had to do that because I had to do solutions when I got into pipelines, which I'll come on to in a moment.
So when we talk about these connection references, is this essentially just it's almost a wire between two connections.
Yeah.
You have a connection
Pointer.
in your solution, and if, for example, I was to move this to a whole new environment, whole new tenant, you're basically just saying that if the other side of this connection exists, then we can connect to it, type of thing.
Yeah, exactly
So
that.
it's not actually creating or directly pointing to the data that the connection may have been built with initially, right?
So in this example, I'll try and show it to you here. It's probably not very easy to show it to you. Okay, what you typically have, if you create a flow, it will say what SharePoint list you want to go to, what SharePoint site, what SharePoint list, who you're going to connect as, Connor. That's all like in that action. What I'm doing here is I'm saying, take it out of that action, give it to the solution to worry about, give it to the connection reference to worry about called SharePoint lists. And then this flow is going to go, SharePoint lists. What is that I'm connecting to? Oh, right, that's SharePoint. All right, who am I connecting as? Oh, right, that's service. So you're handing off all that connection to a different, it's like you're creating a pointer, if you like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so does this work then across tenants? So if we're saying that who the original connection belonged to, and perhaps in your example we may move it between environments and it needs to understand which SharePoint list was originally connected to it and all of that sort of stuff. If we move this to a completely different tenant where that SharePoint list may not exist, how does the connection reference then behave?
That's really interesting, Connor. I do not know specifically how that will behave. I do know that if you're using intra-tenant pipelines, it will deal with it for you. I have a suspicion that I'd like to go and test that so long as you have a connection on the destination environment inside that tenant that it can use, then when you import your solution into that environment, which is one thing you can do, it's a different way of managing it. I think, well, yeah, that's a good point, George. It may be environment variables. I think, yeah, I don't know is the honest answer. My suspicion was that it was going to, during the import process, going, where is it that I'm going to go and get that connection from? And there would be a degree of plumbing at that point. Whereas doing it this way with pipelines that I'll come on to in a moment, it just does it for you. So I don't know. And that's a thing, George. I haven't experimented with environment variables, and I probably should. Okay.
Okay.
Right. So far, I've flagged up. Think about environments, think about solutions, think about connection references, and then with all of those, to be honest, you can create an application lifecycle. You probably, to George's point, you might need to think about environment variables as well. I don't know. But I think the very essence of moving your product between different environments, you've got a capability there to move your products between environments. And I say that because you get this big fat button up here in a moment. I'll show you. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. Cool. Yeah, that's something I'll have to dig into is environment variables. But so you can see you've got this import solution. So if I were to export this, I get a package. If I were to import it, I could bring it into the default environment or another environment. That's one thing that you could do. I'm going to just press a little bit of an accelerate because there's quite a bit to still get through. But let me just skip to the end, actually. Let me just show you what this would look like. What you can do if you've got those fundamentals in place is utilize this screen here. Now, yeah, how do I demonstrate this to you without taking ages? I'm in a default environment here. Let's just go back a step. I've got a solution that I'm happy with. I know is portable because it's got connection references. Going to go into the solution and you'll notice, you won't get this if you haven't set it up, but this little icon here, pipelines, if I click that, I've got this drop down here, which tells me that I have a pipeline I've set up, which will basically take all of that product in that solution and deploy it to my production zone. Now, I'm not going to do it now because it takes a little while, but you can see what it really does is it will take that solution. And in this case, it is a solution that with a SharePoint list item selected, there's a button that you press that triggers a flow. So it is a little bit specific, but it'll move all of that product into a production zone. Now, one observation I've got, doesn't do anything to your base artifacts as far as I can tell. You could still run all those flows in your default environment, but you've now got you've got to copy this version 1.4.0.3 in your production zone, which I love, because what I was then able to do, Connor, was I was able to wire up from the SharePoint list. You might be familiar with this from last week. Wire up the IDs of these buttons to the product. Wrong one. I'm showing you something too soon there. To the product that's just been deployed. So I can start to run the production product knowing that that's not going to get buggered. Excuse my French. It's not going to break. And there's a big caveat in a minute, but I'll just see if that idea makes any sense.
So just on this whole kind of pipeline process here, so to utilize pipelines, I'm not sure if this was answered. Does the things that you would like to move in this pipeline process, do these have to be placed inside of solutions? Or, for example, yes, could I take an app and just do this with an app?
Well, I'm really happy to be corrected, but my belief here is that you want solutions, and the reason for that is solutions encapsulates an awful lot of stuff. It does a lot of checking for your solution for the connection integrity. It's also got references that it uses. Yeah, that's a really interesting one, Connor. I don't believe that you can move an individual flow because you would just export it and import it. I believe that you need to utilize solutions to even think about this process. But that's something I need to go and check in on. But I do believe that.
Nice.
There are a few other things that I've noted that come along with this, and again, more power to the community. A few people pointed out last week as I demonstrated moving a solution, I think, using this process, and they were pointing out that you go right back to your environment. You got to be really careful because this is where cost comes in. That pipeline that I've shown you there moves a product from default to production zone, and there's information plastered all over it, which I'd chosen to ignore, which was talking about managed environments. So really all this means is that the place that you're going to put your product to needs to be, it's just different. I mean, I've got a link again. I will share this. What managed environments are? Yeah, thank you, Connor. You shared that. They're different. You can set up policies around DLP and all sorts of clever stuff. I guess what they're saying is if you're going to go to the pain's the wrong word, if you're going to go to the effort of setting up a lifecycle process for your apps, where you land them, you don't want people to just go in and change stuff, because then you don't really have any control over what's landed. Whereas the reality of what you've got here is, this one, I know that what's landed there was what I developed here and what I took a slice of. So it's a little bit of source control, a little bit of version control to move it forwards into production. So I know that is safe. And if I didn't have a managed environment there, how confident am I that that's the right product that's not been fiddled with, all that great stuff? But there does come a cost with that. Managed environments you get as part of you can utilize them if you have a per app or per, I'm going to get this wrong, per user or per app or per flow. The two license models, the per user or the per flow model. We happen to have one.
Confusing when we talk about licensing, doesn't it? Yeah. John specifically says, try not to ask me too many questions on licensing.
It's honestly, if somebody could ever, I'm going to put this out there now. If you know loads about licenses, we'll buy some time from you to teach me and Connor, because it drives us mad all the time. I get like some of the dimensions of licenses, but really, really simply, I didn't have to worry about this particular one being a managed environment because, Connor and I had been messing around with the Power App and we'd got a per app license, which allowed me to create a managed environment. I got no warning, you see, so I didn't spot it first time round. But yes, there's a license constraint that you've got, if you know it today. But yeah, well, that's it, Lynn. Exactly. Yeah, it changes an awful lot. So where did I get to? Just conscious of time, 16:43. Right. Pipelines are super useful. They're not that difficult to set up. I've already given you the key components, environments. The one thing you need to know is that every environment has a unique ID. So this screen that I'm showing you now gives you a unique ID. I'm not going to show you how to set these things up, but know that every environment has a unique ID. To create environments, I'm really intrigued by this choice, but it's a choice nonetheless. Microsoft have given us an app. So what you might have noticed, the eagle-eyed of you, if I can get back to it, let's just back to my environments. I created a separate dedicated environment called, so I'm just reading the chat there, separate dedicated environment called Pipeline Orchestrator. It's a production environment. I called it that because it's got one thing in it and one thing only. I'll click into it, go to resources. I've probably got an example where I have it open because I can never find the damn thing. Here we go. When you want to set up pipelines, you need to find an app in that little box that I've just shown you there. I'll come back to it. It's called Power Platform Pipelines. Install it. So you just click it, click next, blah, 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 install it in the environment where you want to orchestrate your pipelines from. Sounds really complex. Sorry, I probably clicked around a bit too much there, so I'll just go back over that again. So go to create an orchestrator environment. Yeah, quite. I love that picture. You go to your 365 apps. You get a list of apps in a moment. Install the app. Find the app in that list. I've already forgotten the name of it. Pipeline. Yes, Power Platform Pipelines is the app's name. When you've installed it, you go to your orchestrator environment, which is here. And again, you might have already seen this. Let's just pull it up here. You get an app which looks like this. Now, again, I'm not going to have time to go through all the setup, but really what you do is you say, what environments do I have? Okay, I've got default and I've got production, and you put the IDs in. Okay, what do I now want to do? Okay, well, I want to create a pipeline which moves things. You create the pipeline header, the name of it. Let's just click into it. I want to create a pipeline which has stages. And this all looks really complex, but there's some really good blog posts and videos out there showing you how to do this, and I will post that in. You just create steps, and really all you're doing is you're saying, what do you want to happen at each step? I want this pipeline to take something from a default environment to the production environment. I won't go into all of the details there, but you set up these stages, and when you set it up and you've shared that pipeline with the right people, which is a thing that I did not do for a long time to get this to work, then people who have that shared, excuse me, let's just go back, in the correct environment will get this drop down capability. That's the pipeline I've set up using that app. So it's like, it looks a lot, but when you break it down into small pieces, it's not as hard as you think, which might still then lead you. I don't know what you're thinking right now, Connor. Are you thinking that's something I might experiment with? Or are you thinking, oh man, John, that's way too complex? What are your thoughts?
I think when you really start pulling it apart and thinking about it from more of a logical perspective, I think it's probably much easier to kind of to grasp exactly what's going on here. I think it's very I think it looks very overwhelming for me anyway, as somebody who's never touched this sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to kind of have a go at pulling this apart myself and trying to kind of see how this process actually works.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it seemed a bit overwhelming to me, but I'll be honest, it took me probably 3 hours to invest in all of these different steps and figuring out what clicked to where. But actually, if I think about it like a Russian doll, I've got a solution inside an environment, and I want to move that Russian doll to the next environment. I'm going to need connection references. All right, I get that. Okay, what's going to actually be the conveyor belt that's going to be pipelines? Then you unpick what the pipeline needs, and really all it needs is a little bit of a license and a little bit of a setup in some app. It becomes a bit simpler. It's just having that tick list in your head as to what do I need to create this conveyor belt from A to B. That's putting aside all the business rationale and the sort of the process rationale behind it. But as a process, it isn't that complex. I'll be honest with you, I take quite a lot of joy in just pressing a button to go deploy my latest changes. Of course, it does lend one other thing, which is you may have noticed. Let's just go back to default. So you've got to remember to go back and work in your original location. These are currently turned off, these flows. So another thing I did, it doesn't seem to turn off your flows automatically, which might be just a setting I've not get. So potentially I could have these flows accidentally running in two places. That's one thing that worries me about these pipelines. It's not a full picture yet. But yeah, it wasn't that hard. It just took a little bit of research, and I hope to have shared some of the. I know there's a lot of words, but hope shared some of the steps there. Right, so solutions. Right, let's just read Lynn's message. Reason to use solutions was to package things up for export and import. Well, that's it, Lynn. It can eliminate that need, but as I said at the very beginning, it absolutely does. You've got to go into it with your eyes wide open, because I've only learned probably 10% of the information to know around this, and I already know it's going to cost me, because you're delivering to a managed environment, whereas solutions you could pretty much just take out, put in wherever you want. So I think that's the trade-off. You've got to make that decision. Do I want this single click button to move my products, or do I want cheap, i.e. free? That's what I would answer to that question. So that's it, Connor. That is, I'm going to stop screen sharing now. That's what I wanted to share. I know that's a lot, but I'd be really interested if anybody's inclined to use it and what their journey might look like, or what questions people have.